I have a tough job to do. You know, when I looked at the profile of the audience here, with their connotations on design, in all its forms, and with so much and so many people working on collaborative and networks and so on, that I wanted to tell you, I wanted to build an argument for primary education in a very specific context. In order to do that, in 20 minutes, I have to bring out 4 ideas. It's like 4 pieces of a puzzle. And if I succeed in doing that, maybe you would go back with a thought that you could build on and perhaps help me do my work. The first piece of the puzzle is remoteness and the quality of education. By remoteness, I mean 2 or 3 different kinds of things. Of course, remoteness in its normal sense, which means that as you go further and further away from an urban center, you get to remoter areas. What happens to education? The second or a different kind of remoteness is that within the large metropolitan areas in all over the world, you have pockets like slums or shanty towns or poorer areas which are socially and economically remote from the rest of the city. So it's us and them. What happens to education in that context? So keep both of those ideas of remoteness. We made a guess. The guess was that schools in remote areas do not have good enough teachers. If they do have, they cannot retain those teachers. They do not have good enough infrastructure. And if they had some infrastructure, they have a difficulty maintaining it. But I wanted to check if this is true. So what I did last year was that I hired a car, looked up on Google, found a route into northern India from New Delhi, which sort of kept, which did not cross any big cities or any big metropolitan centers, drove out about 300 kilometers, and wherever we found a school, I administered a set of standard tests, and then took those test results and plotted it on a graph. The graph was interesting, although you need to consider it carefully. I mean, this is a very small sample. You should not generalize from it. But it was quite obvious, or quite clear, that for this particular route that I had taken, the remoter a school was, the worse its results seemed to be. That seemed a little damning, and I tried to correlate it with things like infrastructure, or with the availability of electricity and things like that. To my surprise, it did not correlate. It did not correlate with the size of classrooms, did not correlate with the quality of the infrastructure, did not correlate with the poverty levels. It did not correlate. But what happened was that when I administered a questionnaire to each of these schools, with one single question for the teachers, which was, would you like to move to an urban metropolitan area? 69% of them said yes. And as you can see from that, they say yes just a little bit out of Delhi, and they say no when you hit the rich suburbs of Delhi, because those are relatively better off areas. And then from 200 kilometers out of Delhi, the answer is consistently yes. I would imagine that a teacher who comes or walks into class every day thinking that I wish I was in some other school, probably has a deep impact on what happens to the results. So it looked as though teacher motivation and teacher migration was a powerfully correlated thing with what was happening in primary schools, as opposed to whether the children have enough to eat and whether they're packed tightly into classrooms and that sort of thing. It appears that way. When you take educational technology, then I find in the literature that things like websites, collaborative environments, you've been listening to all that in the morning. It's always piloted first in the best schools, the best urban schools. And according to me, biases the result. the literature, one part of it, the scientific literature consistently blames ET as being overhyped and underperforming. The teachers always say, well, it's fine, but it's too expensive for what it does, because it's being piloted in a school where the students were already getting, let's say, 80% of whatever they could do. You put in this new super duper technology and now they get 83%. So the principal looks at it and says 3% for, $300,000 for getting it. If you took the same technology and piloted it into one of those remote schools where the score was 30%, and let's say it took that up to 40%, that would be a completely different thing. So the relative change that ET, educational technology, would make would be far greater at the bottom of the pyramid than at the top, but we seem to be doing it the other way about. So I came to this conclusion that ET should reach the underprivileged first, not the other way about. And finally came the question of how do you tackle teacher perception. Whenever you go to a teacher and show them some technology, the teacher's first reaction is, you cannot replace a teacher with a machine. It's impossible. I don't know why it's impossible, but even for a moment, if you did assume that it's impossible, I have a quotation from Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer whom I met in Colombo, and he said something which completely solves this problem. He said, a teacher that can be replaced by a machine should be. So it puts the teachers into a tough bind. You have to think. Anyway, so I'm proposing that an alternative primary education, whatever alternative you want, is required where schools don't exist, where schools are not good enough, where teachers are not available, or where teachers are not good enough, for whatever reason. If you happen to live in a part of the world where none of this applies, then you don't need an alternative education. So far I haven't come across such an area, except for one case. I won't name the area, but somewhere in the world people said we don't have this problem because we have perfect teachers and perfect schools. There are such areas, but anyway, it doesn't, I've never heard that anywhere else. I'm going to talk about children and self-organization and a set of experiments which sort of led to this idea of what might an alternative education be like. They're called the hole-in-the-wall experiments. And I'll have to really rush through this. There are a set of experiments. The first one was done in New Delhi in 1999. And what we did over there was pretty much simple. I had an office in those days which bordered a slum, an urban slum. So there was a dividing wall between our office and the urban slum. So I cut a hole inside that wall, which is how it has got the name hole in the wall, and put a pretty powerful PC into that hole, sort of embedded into the wall so that its monitor was sticking out at the other end. A touchpad similarly embedded into the wall. Put in high-speed internet. Put the Internet Explorer there. Put it on altavista.com in those days, and just left it there. And this is what we saw. So that was my office in IIT. Here is the hole in the wall. About 8 hours later, we found this kid. To the right is this 8-year-old child who, and to his left is a 6-year-old girl who's not very tall. And what he was doing was he was teaching her to browse. So it sort of raised more questions than it answered. Is this real? Does the language matter? Because he's not supposed to know English. Will the computer last, or will they break it and steal it? And did anyone teach them? The last question was what everybody said, that, they must have poked their head over the wall and asked the people in your office, can you show me how to do it? And somebody taught you. So I took the experiment out of Delhi and repeated it. This time in a city called Shivpuri, in the center of India, where I was assured that nobody had ever taught anybody anything. So it was a warm day, and the hole in the wall was on that decrepit old building. This is the first kid who came there. Later on turned out to be a 13-year-old school dropout. He came there and he started to fiddle around with the touchpad. Very quickly noticed that when he moves his finger on the touchpad, something moves on the screen. And later on he told me, I have never seen a television where you can do something. So he figured that out. It took him about 2 minutes to figure out that he was doing things to the television. And then, as he was doing that, he made an accidental click by hitting the touchpad. You'll see him do that. He did that, and the Internet Explorer changed page. 8 minutes later, he looked from his hand to the screen, and he was browsing. He was going back and forth. When that happened, he started calling all the neighborhood children, like children would, let's say, come and see what's happening over here. And by the evening of that day, 70 children were all browsing. So 8 minutes and an embedded computer seemed to be all that we needed there. So we thought that this is what was happening, that children in groups can self-instruct themselves to use a computer and the internet. But under what circumstances? At this time, there was the main question was about English. People said, you know, you really ought to have this in Indian languages. So I said, what? Have what? Shall I translate the internet into some Indian language? That's not possible. So it has to be the other way about. But let's see, how do the children tackle the English language? I took the experiment out to northeastern India, to a village called Madantusi, where for some reason there was no English teacher. So the children had not learnt English at all. And I built a similar hole in the wall. One big difference in the villages, as opposed to the urban slums, there were more girls than boys who came to the kiosk. In the urban slums, the girls tend to stay away. I left the computer there with lots of CDs. I didn't have any internet. And came back 3 months later. So when I came back there, I found these two kids, 8 and 12-year-olds, who were playing a game on the computer. And as soon as they saw me, they said, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. So I was a little surprised. But, you know, how on earth did they know all this? And they said, well, we picked it up from the CDs. So I said, but how did you understand what's going on over there? So they said, well, you've left this machine which talks only in English, so we had to learn English. So then I measured, and they were using 200 English words with each other, mispronounced but correct usage. Words like exit, stop, file, save, that kind of thing, not only to do with the computer but in their day-to-day conversations. So Madantusi seemed to show that language was not a barrier. In fact, they may be able to teach themselves the language if they really wanted to. Finally, I got some funding to try this experiment out to see if these results are replicable, if they happen everywhere else. India is a good place to do such an experiment in, because we have all the ethnic diversities, all the the genetic diversity, all the racial diversities, and also all the socio-economic diversities. So I could actually choose samples to cover a cross-section that would cover practically the whole world. So we went, I did this for almost 5 years, and this experiment really took us all the way across the length and breadth of India. This is the Himalayas, up in the north, very cold. I also had to check or invent an engineering design which would survive outdoors. And I was using regular, normal PCs. So I needed different climates, for which India is also great, because we have very cold, very hot, and so on. This is the deserts to the west. Near the Pakistan border. You see here a little clip of one of these villages. The first thing that these children did was to find a website to teach themselves the English alphabet. Then to central India, very warm, moist, fishing villages where humidity is a very big killer of electronics. So we had to solve all the problems we had without air conditioning and with very poor power. So most of the solutions that came out used little blasts of air put at the right places to keep the machines running. I'm going to just cut this short. We did this over and over again. This sequence is also nice. This is a small child, 6-year-old, telling his elder sister what to do. And this happens very often with these computers, that the younger children are found teaching the older ones. what did we find? We found that 6 to 13-year-olds can self-instruct in a connected environment irrespective of anything that we could measure. So if they have access to their computer, they will teach themselves, including intelligence. I couldn't find a single correlation with anything. But it had to be in groups, and that may be of great interest to this group, because all of you are talking about groups. So here was the power of what a group of children can do if you lift the adult intervention. Just a quick idea of the measurements. We took standard statistical techniques, so I'm going to not talk about that. But we got a clean learning curve, almost exactly the same as what you would get in a school. So I leave it at that because, I mean, it sort of says it all, doesn't it? What could they learn to do? Basic Windows functions, browsing, painting, chatting and email, games and educational material, music downloads, playing video. In short, what all of us does. And over 300 children would become computer literate and be able to do all of these things in 6 months with one computer. So how do they do that? If you calculated the actual time of access, it will work out to minutes per day. So that's not how it's happening. What you have actually is, there is one child operating the computer. Surrounding him are usually 3 other children who are advising him to on what they should do. If you test them,